In this week's edition of The Economist, we have a special report on American foreign policy by Edward Carr, our foreign editor. I'm Robert Guest, the United States editor, and I'm joined by Edward here today to discuss his special report. Edward, you say that Americans are too gloomy about their position in the world, that after a decade of bad news, actually things aren't quite as bad as they seem. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think if you look at the kind of books that are being written about foreign policy, if you look at the commentary on foreign policy, it's all against this background of decline, a sense that things are difficult, we're not appreciated, we had two difficult wars, we've had an economic crisis. It's all very, very hard. And I think that that's overstated.
So what are the strengths then that people are missing?
Well, fundamentally, if you look at how powerful America is, I think if you do that kind of audit on American power, you conclude that it's still by far the most powerful nation in the world. And if you look across the various areas of power, that's military power, economic power, soft power, that's a power of kind of values, and then overall primacy or a sense of American hegemony, it's often called. If you look at all of those things, America is by far, in all of those areas, still the most powerful nation in the world.
So, I suppose it sort of starts with a sort of sense of security at home. You have quite that memorable line that America has friends to the north and south and fish to the east and west. So it doesn't have to worry about threats to the homeland itself. It sort of thinks much more in terms about threats to the global order, and it attempts to police those things. Do you think, though, that many people think that there's a threat from China to that? How would you assess that?
It is true that if you look at what's at the back of most people's minds when they worry about the decline of the United States as a global power, what they have in mind is China. And it's true also that if you think about when China's likely to become the world's biggest economy, that could easily be within the next decade, certainly the next decade and possibly even before. The point is, though, that being the biggest economy may be one thing, but being the world's, learning how to use the size of your economy to project geopolitical power is an entirely different thing. Militarily, China has no prospect of challenging the United States for decades, I think. Economically, it's true that China will be the biggest economy, but measured by other things like GDP per head, it won't be at all. And perhaps in some ways, GDP per head is also important because it's a measure of the technological capacity and human capital in an economy, both of which are important for geopolitics. And then in terms of values, well, I still think that, in spite of the difficult decade that the United States has had, it's still somewhere where people look to for values and for all sorts of ideas about the way they want to live their lives.
That's interesting because when you look at the alliances that America has, it's not just that its military spending is the highest in the world by far, it's also that many of the other big military spenders are either formally its allies or are vaguely friendly towards it in the way that, say, India is. That makes a big difference. Somehow America, for all that people complain about it, seems to be a lot better at making friends than China is.
That's absolutely right. If you look at the formal alliances, you have something like 60 formal alliances, and then if you look at the number of countries that maybe lean towards the United States, it's maybe another 50. Well, that is really the preponderance of power, and maybe only 20 countries or so lean against the United States. Now, that's not to say that in any given conflict, all of those countries that generally lean towards the United States would be by its side. But I think it is a measure of the kind of mountain that China has to climb if it's going to challenge the United States for primacy. I don't think that's actually the risk. The risk for the United States is not a challenge for primacy, it's rather that the world is a difficult world in which to get things done.
How do you think Barack Obama has been handling foreign policy?
I think you need to look at this in two halves. In his first term, his main consideration was the economy at home and what to do about these two very difficult wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The economy at home might seem odd as a question of foreign policy, but it matters in two respects. One is because economic success and the success of the United States model of an economy is a very important component of its economic power and its soft power. And Obama really needed to kind of sort that out. That was a huge problem for the country in the first term. And the wars were a problem for the obvious reason that they were a huge drain on resources and on America's moral standing in the world. I think broadly he did sort those things out as much as he could, and he was right to concentrate them in the first term. But the second term, I think, is about other things. And what worries me is that there's still this sense of a reluctance to be involved, a wariness about getting sucked into sort of foreign entanglements, which has been an inhibition on his foreign policy in the second term, and I don't think has really helped the United States or actually been particularly good for the world.
You're thinking particularly about Syria here?
I'm thinking about the Middle East in general, actually, but it's not just there. I mean, I think he's been quite uninvolved in Europe, in Latin America. There's really broadly neglected. And perhaps the main aspect of his policy, which was a rebalancing or pivoting towards Asia, has been pretty half-hearted.
And you think that's how it's felt in the region, that people feel that he hasn't really engaged with them, he hasn't been there pressing the flesh enough?
The pivot's interesting. I mean, it was designed, and I think it was based on an entirely reasonable analysis that said that a lot of the important issues over the next few decades for the United States would be in Asia, and that therefore being distracted by conflict in the Middle East and Afghanistan was a bad use of American resources. But because the policy hasn't really been carried through, it's managed to alarm the Chinese and made them feel that there may be a sense that America's trying to get everyone in the region to gang up on China, without actually doing a huge amount to reassure the region. And so I think the pivot needs a lot more work.
I suppose the other thing that people worry about, there's an argument that the biggest threat to American power in the world is not China but Medicare. Or another way of saying that, social spending in America is sort of at almost European levels, but taxes are at a much lower level, and so America's spending like a country with a big welfare state and taxing like a country with a lean welfare state, and that as people age, that basically they're just not going to be able to make their books balance, and that's going to lead to sort of big cuts in America's ability to spend on the military, and will eventually hobble their economic vitality. How real a threat do you think that is?
I think the whole question about debt and the state of the government in the United States is often taken to be literally a problem about borrowing and literally a problem about entitlements, and that we're headed for disaster, and that will mean that America can't afford its role as the world's superpower. I don't really agree with that. I think that, in fact, these problems are readily solvable. There are plenty of ideas about what to do. It's a political problem, in fact. It's not an economic problem. And the real damage of things like how the US deals with the sequester and how you're stopping government because you can't agree on this or that. I think the real problem there is actually the lack of credibility that the superpower, which is expected, after all, to go around the world and deal with some really sort of difficult problems to which there is no easy answer, can't deal with things at home, and the projection of that incapacity at home to deal with things abroad. For instance, when you see that Obama can't go abroad to a rather important Asian summit because of the government shutdown, that sends a really bad signal about its capacity to undertake foreign policy.
Yes, and I suppose presumably when he does go abroad and people sense that he doesn't have any kind of cooperation from Congress back home, that people worry, if he's making promises with us, if he's negotiating with us, can he actually deliver on them? That's
true, and it's also quite dangerous, actually, because the repeatedly in history, foreigners have looked at the United States, seen what they thought was a divided country that was incapable of acting coherently, underestimated the United States and done foolish things, and then discovered to their horror that actually the US can galvanize amazingly quickly. I still think that's true today. Were the United States, even with Congress and the administration as divided as they are, were they to face a genuine threat, they would come together pretty quickly, I think.
Ed, thanks very much.
Thank you.